Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us today. My name is Chelsea Domenico, and on behalf of Ethisphere, I am pleased to welcome you to our webcast breaking down the BELA Data Governance Survey. What do the results tell us about emerging best practices? Over the next 45 minutes or so, you'll hear from my colleague and expert, Craig Moss, as we dive into the results of the survey and share insights and trends on how companies are establishing and implementing data governance programs, including the management of different types of sensitive data across the enterprise and with third parties. If you've ever joined us for an Ethisphere webcast before, you know that we love to take your questions throughout today's session. So please use that chat box you see on your webcasting platform. Our goal, of course, is to answer as many questions as we can. However, if we do run out of time, Craig or myself will follow up with you via email afterwards. Following the live webcast today, you will receive an email from us, including the recording of today's webcast presentation and PowerPoint materials. And of course, as a BELA member, you'll have direct access to these materials on our BELA member hub, which will provide you with that link as well. Now, with that said, I'd like to turn the floor over to Craig, my colleague and Executive Vice President here at Ethisphere, to begin today's session. Craig, the floor is all yours.
Great, thanks, Chelsea. Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to be talking with you, and I hope you find the next 45 minutes to be interesting. So what we're going to cover is data governance and really look at what it covers and who manages it, about the reporting, also a little bit about data classification, which is really a key aspect of data governance, and the risk assessment process that people went through. As Chelsea mentioned, please feel free to ask questions along the way. If it's something I know I'm going to cover in a minute or two, I will either, just let you know, or we'll get to it at some point. So, since you're all BELA members, I don't think I need to spend a lot of time telling you about the Ethisphere and the BELA program. I did want to mention specifically, though, that this work evolved from work that we were doing with one company, really looking at data governance and a little bit about the relationship between cybersecurity and the protection of IP and data. And so as part of that, we did a survey and it went out to a limited number of BELA members. So some of you on the call may not have participated in the survey. We targeted a subset of the BELA members to do the survey. And as we move forward, what I want to go over now is really the results, what we found, and to give you a little bit of insight into some of what we see in this. So we're going to start off here with what it covers and who manages it. And one of the things that I see a lot is that the idea of data governance has really evolved and accelerated due to GDPR and the coming California Consumer Privacy Act. And companies really focused on data privacy. And so if you look at this, the results here, it's interesting, privacy of data is really the number one thing that data governance covers. And also number two then is regulations. So if you think about it, this really supports the idea that companies thinking about data governance, now they're starting to think more broadly, but it really seems to have emerged from the idea of data privacy. When you get into here, what does it actually cover? This is kind of interesting to me, is over on the left side, people here say that our program covers all types of data, and 79% said yes. But then when faced with specific types of data that it covers, you'll see that it drops off substantially. And the only two things that it really are at 100% are personal identifiable information, or PII, and then confidential employee information, PII. So if we think about it again, on one hand, people say, oh yeah, it covers all types of data. But then if you start to break it down into PII and then other types of confidential business information, either that the company has internally or receives from third parties, and suddenly what is covered really tails off to a low point here about trade secrets received from customers. So that was a really interesting finding here, is that it kind of supports the idea that when people are thinking, these large companies are thinking about data governance, it really is still keyed around the idea of data privacy and protection of PII. Oh, just as a little background, in doing the survey, there were about 30 companies that responded partially, and I think it was 17 completed the entire survey. So it's a small data set. The majority of the companies were from the US, although we did have some from Japan and Switzerland. The majority of companies were responding from headquarters, was over 75% of the respondents were at headquarters. 54% had 25,000 or more employees. And from an industry standpoint, it was all over the map. Healthcare, insurance, IT, manufacturing. There was really no dominant industry that participated. So again, in terms of what it covers, the focus where everybody's saying it covers it is really around PII. Now here we get into another really interesting thing. And for those of you that are familiar with the work that we do at Ethisphere and the type of assessments that we do, we talk a lot about cross-functional team. And specifically here, when we ask the general question, the following best describes how we're organized to lead the establishment and implementation of our data governance program, high percent, 71% said it's really done by a cross-functional team. And if you look at the others, an individual data governance officer or a specific functional area, they really lagged far behind. Then though, when we dig into this a little more and we start to get specific around what does this cross-functional team do, you'll see that the responses change quite a bit. So when we started to break down that idea of establishing and implementing and look at it in more detail, so over on the left, does one functional department have the ultimate authority and responsibility for establishing the policies? So this is around policy establishment. Suddenly cross-functional team drops way down to only 29%. I mean, and if you look at it here, no clear responsibility is at 24%. So really at a foundational level, which is establishing the policies, suddenly when you start to ask more specific questions, the breakdown changes quite a bit. When we look over here, does one functional department have authority and responsibility for implementation? You'll see here that it's similar in terms of the breakdown. So the idea that before 70+% said cross-functional teams are doing it, when you actually start to drill down, it's not. And we'll go into what department tends to have responsibility in a minute, where you'll also see that there's really no consistency. It really is kind of across the board. So these I thought were kind of interesting findings so far about the establishment and implementation. Now we look into monitoring and enforcing the policies, because if you think about a program, you have establishing the policy, you have implementing the policy, and then you have the idea of monitoring and enforcing that policy. And you look here again, cross-functional team has maintained a pretty consistent 29% across the board, which is still a far cry from the 70+% before. But then you look here, no clear responsibility. A third of the companies that responded, when you get down to who's actually monitoring to see if people are following the policies, 35% say nobody's really responsible for that. And we know from experience that if nobody is responsible, it's probably not happening. So this was a really interesting finding too. Now we get into if it's one department. So if we think about if it is one department, so this is a subset of the respondents. So again, small data set, but kind of interesting. So if we look here, the blue is the establishing the policies. So we see that it's pretty split up between legal, info security, enterprise risk management. and operations across the establishment. If we get into overseeing the implementation, again, we see legal as info security and ERP. Monitoring and enforcing was split between legal and info security. So it shows again here that there's still not a lot of clarity around the intersection between legal and info security. And we see this a lot also with related to work we do in cybersecurity. We do a lot of work related to cybersecurity maturity programs. And there's a lot of discrepancy in how companies and how legal and the IT or the cybersecurity teams interact in different companies. And we do see that in a lot of organizations, there's really a lack of clarity about the responsibilities and where it ends with one company or one department and starts with the other department. So as we drill down here, again, I don't really see anything where I could go back and say, there is a clear pattern here. What I see is companies still grappling with it, grappling with the idea that on paper or in theory, they would love to have it be a cross-functional team, which really is the best approach to this type of thing, because that's the best way to embed it in how a company operates and make it practical for people to be able to comply with the policy. But we don't really see any kind of consistent pattern here. And even those that are having it be assigned to a functional department, there's really not even a consistency in where that's being assigned. And the reason we did this in the first place was to try to help one company in particular to look to see if there was a best practice or something emerging as a best practice. And through this part so far, we haven't really seen anything like that. We've seen that it is largely PII driven. We've seen that it's not covering all the different types of information. And we did have a note here that I understand about the trade secrets being understandably the least protected or covered. And I understand that in some industries, trade secrets are not really shared and you really don't want other people's trade secrets. But even the drop off between PII and confidential business information, I thought was kind of an interesting drop off there. Any questions so far before we get into the next section? So we've really looked at, how do people think about it broadly, and then who's responsible? I'll pause here for a minute and see if we have any questions. Okay. So next up is we're really looking now at the data governance activities. And the question here was, the people that manage data governance routinely oversee or perform the following activities. So if we look across this spread, we see here that it's on the left side, policies and procedures. So it tends to be, at that point, those are really what I would call establishment pieces of it, to review and update the policies and procedures. As we look across, though, we see some other things here that are kind of interesting to me. One is related to the classification. It kind of drops off. And one of the things that we see in a lot of organizations is data classification is a challenge for companies. And I'll tell you a little story that is related to this, but not, that's related to this, I think, is one, we went in to work with a company, not the one involved in this project. And we started with the legal department and we asked them about how they classified data and the number of classifications they had. And the legal department told us that they had 4 levels of data classification. So then we went to the IT department and we're looking at access control. And we were talking to the IT department about how they structured access control and how many levels of data classification were involved. And they said, well, we use 3 levels. And I said, you use 3, but legal has 4. And they said, yeah, we kind of knew that, but we started with 3 and we haven't really changed it. So then I went out to the business units and I started to ask them, well, functionally, you have confidential business information you're dealing with. And how many levels of data classification do you functionally work with? And they said 2. So here we have an organization with 3 different ways of classifying data depending on the department that they're in. And as you can tell from that kind of situation, it's not going to work too well because it's very inconsistent. So the fact that data governance, only a little over half see data overseeing classification, I think that this is an area where increasingly data governance teams are going to take more of a role in this. And I think that there will be one of the areas that they tend to be that bridge between legal, IT, business units, whatever the other relevant areas are. So that's one thing that jumped out to me here. The other thing is, if we look over here about developing strategies for value creation using data, this was kind of surprising because it's at 64%, but earlier in the very beginning, we had asked them about, does data governance involved in thinking about value creation? And it was a much, much lower number. So I picked up a little bit of inconsistency there. The other thing interesting here is that in terms of monitoring the laws, is only 2/3 of the companies involved say that data governance is involved in monitoring the laws, even though earlier it was clearly said that it was one of the issues or responsibilities was around regulatory issues. So I thought that was kind of an interesting thing too, and shows again to me that we're not really at a mature stage with how data governance is really being operated in organizations. Finally, the other thing here that's interesting, and then I'll go to the next slide to about this, is here it says that 76% report to senior management, and they think that that's one of the key, or routinely, that they're routinely reporting to senior management. Now we go to the next slide, and here we got more specific around reporting to senior management. And you look at, although 76% said that they routinely report to senior management, when you get a little more detailed into who and when, you'll see here that it's not that consistent. So it goes from a low of reporting to the board only 6% of the time, but even reporting to senior management here drops off to 47%. So again, I think that what I see with something like this is that when people are faced with a broader question, they think, sure, yeah, we definitely, part of our job would be to report to senior management here. But then if you break it down a little bit more detail and say, well, how do you report? Or when do you report? And then suddenly it drops off. So that I thought was also an interesting finding from this. Any questions or comments so far? No questions either means one of two things. It means that everything is like crystal clear and you're all following it really, really well. Or it means that you've completely lost interest and I've confused you all to no end. So I'm gonna proceed along the first line of thinking, that it's crystal clear and you've got it, you don't really have any questions from me. Let's go to the next slide. Data classification. So here we wanted to look a little bit into how people classify data. And you look here, and the thing that jumps out to me is you're at 41% say we have policies and procedures. Another 20 or 30% say they have policies but don't have procedures in place. And if we aggregate this, this kind of points to the idea that classification still is a challenging issue for people and for organizations. And what I often see with companies that have policies and not procedures is that there's really inconsistent implementation of it. And I think that this kind of supports the story that I told earlier about the data classification. So this, I think, is another area where data governance is going to end up taking more of a role. And I think that it's going to be, one of the tensions that we see in companies right now is data privacy and the reaction to GDPR and the California Consumer Privacy Act. They have data privacy officers that have come in many organizations, the data privacy officer has a very, very specific fundamental role that is tied to PII and PHI, personal health information and personal identifiable information. And they don't really have a broader role or mandate to be thinking about confidential business information. As a result of that, it's created some tension. And fundamentally, PII is something that organizations try to protect and keep very closely held. But fundamentally, confidential business information needs to be shared. And in this global business environment, it needs to be shared internally between departments. It needs to be shared externally with third parties, be it suppliers that are manufacturing for you, be it channel partners that are selling products or services. So confidential business information inherently has to be controlled and protected. PII, the philosophy tends to be to protect and hold it very, very close and have as few people look at it or touch it as possible. So that's one of the areas where we see a lot of tension in organizations. And our thinking initially was that the data governance team would be the one that would kind of be responsible and bridge it as the umbrella. And it may go in that direction, but we're not sure yet. I had a conversation with a company recently, and they were starting to, their business model was evolving. And their business model was evolving in a way where they were utilizing more customer information as part of what they were doing in I can't say too much, but is part of their core value. And core value proposition was to utilize customer information in some unique ways. So in doing that, they actually had set up a whole different department that was solely focused on protection of customer information. Not from a PII standpoint, but from confidential business information coming from customers. And that was being set up outside of the department that was managing internal confidential business information. So just different ways that companies are doing it. But ultimately, I think in an organization, classification becomes one of the foundational aspects of it that you need to have in place so that people know how to play the game and they know what rules they need to follow. So here's the next question was, our data governance programs considers and helps establish guidelines for the following. And take a look at the answers here. And here's another place where how to utilize data for value creation. It hopped way, way up here. Whereas before it was always kind of not really a major issue. So I'm not sure why it hopped up here, but that was one thing that jumped out to me. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that approaches to minimizing the data collected was a little bit lower than I thought, because data minimization is an issue that is becoming a bigger and bigger topic with data privacy programs. So companies are now thinking, do I really need the person's name and email? Or could I just aggregate the information that I really need and drop some of the PII stuff to make it easier for me from a regulatory standpoint? So I thought that was interesting. And the other is what data needs to be collected. You would think that data governance team would have a little bit more oversight into what data needs to be collected. But to me, again, this kind of just substantiates the idea that data governance programs are not yet the umbrella that I think companies hope they will become. So if you take a minute to look at some of the other things here about approaches, what data need, how long it needs to be retained, how long it's retained, all kind of interesting things. So now we look at the risk elements. The following specific elements are taken into account in our data governance risk assessments. So interesting to me, nothing hit 100%. That to me was really kind of shocking. IT security is the highest, which makes sense, but I was kind of surprised at some of the others being as low as they are, and that there wasn't really any consistency here. So the data governance teams, again, are not really at a mature stage in terms of their risk assessments either. You know, it seems to vary from company to company. I don't think it's that we can say that there's any pattern here. There's a lot of things that are like 2/3, a few things that are, you know, a little bit lower than that, but really across the board, um, it's more at the 2/3 level is where people are doing it. And then something like, and I know this is cut off, but like the 29.4% over here on the left, attractiveness. This is attractiveness of the information to others or to hackers. And one of the things that, you know, we, and from a cybersecurity standpoint, one of the things that we would always talk about with companies is to prioritize and identify what are your crown jewels and what would be the most attractive information you have to hackers. And so the fact that data governance teams are not really thinking about that, I thought was kind of an interesting thing. So here's, again, is looking at the risk factors from physical security, maturity of internal controls, reputational damage that it would cause, business impact if that data was lost or compromised. Any questions so far? Okay, I'm going to go on. So in terms of about our data governance program, at the end of this, we wanted people to give us kind of an overview of where their data governance program stood. And so there's 4 questions that we asked here. So one is, do you use your program to build trust with customers? And that's the blue bar. And we look across there, there's really no consistent response here. So in terms of people being able to say to their customers, yeah, our data governance program is one of the reasons you should do business with us. It provides us with a competitive advantage. That's not really consistent. We do have 23% saying they strongly agree with that statement, but it's really kind of balanced across the board. And again, that just shows to me that it's kind of early stage. We at Ethisphere, we believe that organizations can develop a competitive advantage by having stronger programs related to data protection and cybersecurity. Next one we asked was, could you tell a compelling story to regulators from your program? So again, because of a regulatory issue here, I see a question came in. Let me finish this one thought, Jonathan, and then I'll come to your question. But if we look at here from a regulator's standpoint, we wanted to see, do you feel that you're able to, your program would be compelling to a regulator, that it would show them that you have the pieces in place, whether you're trying to specifically meet GDPR or CCPA, do you have the elements of a robust program in place? And again, here, the majority is neither. So they're kind of in the middle, maybe, maybe not. We do have a couple that thought, you know, if some that thought that they would be able to tell a good story to a regulator. Let me go over now to the question that we got in. And are there strong elements? It's kind of cut off on the side of my screen. I'm trying to move it over. Chelsea, could you read that over to me? Because
Yeah,
I think
I
I
was
got.
going to jump in. So the question is, are there developing elements for the risk assessment that companies should be looking at but are not universally doing so?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that one of the things from a risk assessment standpoint is to it flows back into the data classification to an extent, is to understand what the crown jewels are and to be able to think about the loss of that data and how that would compromise the business. And when I think about data loss, I think you all need to think about it in a couple different ways. So one would be, what if I lost it in a way where I couldn't access it? It was corrupted, or there was a ransomware attack, or something happened where I could no longer utilize that data. That's one type of data loss that should be part of a risk assessment. And with that, to be thinking about the probability of it happening and then the negative impact. The second part of data loss would be, what happens if it went public? So you think about like the Sony breach, where a lot of information went public. Not only could they not use it for a period of time at Sony, but it also went public. So that's another type of data loss that is critical, and that your risk assessment should really be thinking about that aspect of it also. What would that do to your reputation? What would it do to your, you take a financial hit. It could spur certain types of legal action. That's the second type of data loss. The other piece to this, though, is business continuity. What would happen if you lost that data and could not operate your business for a period of time? What would happen if it was a day? What would happen if it was a week? And for each business, there's a real difference in that. We do work with, we've been doing assessments of a number of law firms related to cybersecurity. And from a law firm standpoint, oh, you want me to go back to the previous slide? Okay. From a law firm standpoint, data loss is absolutely crippling to them from a reputational standpoint, and the related financial impact would be crippling. From a business continuity standpoint, it's not really as big of an issue, right? Because if their websites go down for a week, it's not a direct hit. If their email systems go down, they can use telephones. There's a host of things that they can do. So each business really needs to think through these things very, very specifically. And if you look here across this board span here, the other thing that I think is really critical is the maturity of your internal controls, which is in the middle, that purple one. And then over on the right, I know it's cut off in this slide, but maturity of uh, data protection controls of your third parties also. Because as you're sharing data with other parties, you do want to understand the maturity of the controls that they have in place. So those are a couple things that a lot of companies don't really include in their risk assessment. So the next thing that we looked at here, we wanted to think about, do we have the right balance in our data governance between centralization and flexibility? And that's the gray bar here. And again, nothing really jumped out about it. It's really kind of across the board. Some people thought almost half or a little less than half, 40% think that they do have that right mix. And then the final question is data governance embedded in our culture? And here again, it's pretty much across the board, which is something that we think increasingly, in the digital business environment that you're all operating in today, data governance is going to have to become more of a core competency. And it's really going to have to go beyond just being a data privacy issue and focused on PII to really looking at broadly, how are you as an organization managing and utilizing data from both the value creation standpoint, but also in terms of the protection. And how do you effectively control that protection in an environment where you inherently have to share it internally between departments and also with third parties? We're doing some work looking at utilization of data internally in companies. And I'll tell you one quick story that's kind of related to this about the importance of data sharing and being able to control that. We're looking at a large retail company, and we were talking to the e-com department, and we were talking separately to the stores, the physical location people. And we were trying to look at the data governance and sharing between those two departments of the same company, both with the same ultimate goal of trying to help the company to sell product. And the degree of data sharing was minimal. The degree of frustration between those two departments was extremely high. Neither department was really effectively sharing data with the other. So e-com wasn't sharing it with stores, stores weren't sharing it with e-com, because they didn't really have they didn't really have a need for it that was beneficial to themselves. So their departments were being measured on how much gets sold in the store. The e-coms only care about what gets sold online. There was no shared performance metrics, and there was no organization like a data governance organization that was there to try to shepherd or lead this and say, hey, we actually do have a lot of data that we could share internally that would make us a more effective organization. I think that that's going to become another role for data governance, is to really to understand the the scope of the data that the organization has and really understand the protection of it, but also the effective sharing and value creation of it. That's why we added some questions in here on value creation under data governance, and we got very inconsistent answers about it. We do think that that is going to be an area where it's going to increasingly grow. And the other thing that jumps out at me is that cross-functional collaboration is going to be absolutely critical. And if we go back to that early one where 70+% say, yeah, that's all cross-functional collaboration. But then when we drilled down, we saw that it wasn't really. I think that that is going to have to become real. And companies are going to have to find ways to build a data governance guild or committee or whatever you want to call it that is going to be cross-functional, that really does have a common purpose in mind, and to really think about, okay, we really should be looking at all types of data. If we go back, I don't believe that data governance programs should be overly focused just on PII. Clearly, you need that as part of a data privacy program, but I think data governance ultimately is going to be the umbrella over that is above that, that's above PII and data privacy, and it's also above protection of confidential information and trade secrets. How it interacts with cybersecurity is going to be one of the interesting things that comes up. And some of the people that I talk to in multinationals think that they really look at it as a Venn diagram, where there's an overlap, and people are kind of debating how much overlap is there, and is it 30% overlap? Will it be 60% overlap? But the idea is that cross-functional teams are going to be absolutely essential for effective data governance, and that the intersection of it and cybersecurity is going to accelerate in the future. And the other just closing thought here is that I mentioned before, but I want to reiterate, is that it really is also something where you have to understand the difference between protecting PII and being able to effectively protect and control and share confidential business information. And I think that that's going to be one of the ultimate roles of the data governance team, is really thinking about how that works in an organization and being able to effectively structure cooperation and collaborations internally that make that happen. So that's really the end of what I prepared. Um, I see we have a few minutes left um, before we hit the 45-minute mark. Hopefully this was valuable to you. I didn't see a lot of questions, which again can either be good, bad, or indifferent, but any questions now? Anybody have anything that, or comments? Any comments that you have on what you saw? So we got a nice comment. Thank you, Ted. Extremely valuable, a lot to take in. Yeah, there is, and very useful. I appreciate that. The thing that was kind of interesting and a little frustrating to me is there wasn't really clarity. We didn't come back and where I could say to you, you know, boom, this is what we see happening. We see a lot of people still grappling and struggling with this. And Ted, I see Ted with another one. We use CMMI to monitor risk, and it highlighted in the classification issues. The need to update it over time is key. Absolutely, absolutely. Keeping risk assessments updated is critical. And one of the things, you know, in at Ethisphere, we have a series of maturity assessments that we use for cyber, for related to this topic, cyber, IP protection, trade secret protection. And one of the things we look at is the maturity of the risk assessment program. So how often is it done? What information is used in assessing the risk? Are they looking at probability and negative impact? Things like that. I think it's a really good point that you bring up there, Ted. Any other questions? If this would be if this is a topic that's an area of interest to you, anybody on the call, get in touch with us. You know, it's an area that we see is going to become increasingly important to all of your organizations. And because it's early stage, we think that it might be a valuable role that we could play in helping you to learn from each other and see how, you know, what could emerge as a best practice. Chelsea, anything else or back over to you?
That's all here. Thanks so much, Craig. And, you know, a special thank you for those that joined us for the live broadcast today. And even more special thanks to those BELA members, the select BELA members that did participate within the survey. You know, Craig said if anyone does have questions and you'd like to reach out, I'm going to be sending a follow-up email that will include access to the link that has the live recording, as well as these presentation materials you saw today. So that'll be included in my email, as long with how to access them on the BELA Member Hub. So please feel free to share those with your colleagues that weren't able to join today. You know, if you have any other questions, don't hesitate to email me. I'll include Craig's email within the follow-up so you have his contact details. But thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to continuing working with you in the future. Thanks again, Craig.
Thanks a lot, Chelsea. Bye, everybody. Thanks very much.